I suppose at 7 in the morning it's okay to begin my lecture. I live in a small building and I'm deaf, so I don't know if I'm disturbing anybody. But those in the climate change movement particularly wonder what can be done satisfactorily to meaningfully attempt to defeat the forces of fascism behind climate change without further endangering ourselves with reckless conflict. What I propose to do is answer that. Many people who are aware of my background from Pittsburgh know that I have a long standing engagement with the administration of the University of Pittsburgh over the Reagan era formulas about the so called nature of reality. Even if you discount the extremism, they, after all, murdered my father, engaged in terrorism and torture of me as a child, and created a false narrative to cover it up. But I love Pittsburgh, and it doesn't do any good for anybody to be villainized by those who love you. So I'll address this to a sort of kinder, gentler philosophy of the nature of reality by which Pitt manages to seam its way along despite the catastrophe that their negligence has visited upon us. And I'd like to introduce an important word in defeat of fascism: administration. We're dealing with a coalition that cannot be trusted, and we need administration that can be trusted. Their kinder, gentler assertion is that, after all, we live in an adversarial system. I'd like to take a look back for a moment at who my grandfather was, which you can see up on the wall was a press reporter type, and he did indeed work for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I used to have a picture. It was confiscated by the irregular forces in the so-called adversarial system of terrorism, domestic terror. Used to have a picture he took of Eleanor Roosevelt at the UN Pavilion. You could tell who it was. She was a very distinctive lady. And you could tell that he took great care in taking the photograph not to disturb her. Well, they also avoided a letter from one of her friends to me, a woman named Martha Gellhorn, who lived in the White House with her. People who would destroy someone like me purposefully and with targeting and direction are a coalition that cannot be trusted. However, they have developed a narrative that I am even less to be trusted. And in order to do that, they've said that I need them more than they need me, and that I visited an intolerable humiliation on a community that has vowed death before dishonor. The morbid extremism at work is obvious, but it also comes from Major League Baseball, very important factor in what brought me to the area that I live in now, which is Seattle and Tacoma. So when I discuss administration as a plausible antidote to a coalition that cannot be trusted, I'm going to focus on Major League Baseball in the city of Seattle. But I'd also like to discuss the mindset that is at work, because when Schwarzenegger promoted Greta Thunberg, he was using a girl who is sincere. And his faction had spoken to me before. A man named Jim Hagerman from the Pentagon told me it is widely believed in the Pentagon that the Earth just isn't going to make it. When I asked him why they don't do more about it, he said, "Who cares? I've lived a good life." Well, what we're dealing with is a group of people who have hired a syndicate like J. Walter Thompson, maybe even J. Walter Thompson himself, a man who was hired by Augusto Pinochet to give a makeover to his fascist um, regime in Chile, and a advertising firm that got its start during the Civil War, in which he was a Marine, who established the first large advertising firm in America at the time of Frederick Douglass and the Emancipation Proclamation, and who did a movie, participated in the movie The Seven Voyages of Sinbad, which evokes the situation in the Ukraine. So when I say that I don't like to villainize someone I love, I mean it. I don't. And I don't intend to do any superfluous villainizing about someone whose mission I approve of. But I do want to look at the background of how the celebrity superstate has become filled with gargoyles and rotters who believe that there are important people, and then they don't say subhumans, they say fans. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the negligence of administration. There's an old saying, those who can do, those who can't teach. I don't happen to believe it works that way, and neither did my father. Those who can teach, and those who can't try to make sure that nobody else can either. There's a sort of kicking of the scholars' notebooks that comes out of Major League Baseball when they come out strutting and preening and making themselves out to be the ferocious, manipulative jinx of the poet, demanding 7 labors of sacrifice from the man who could have saved John Lennon. And we need to discuss how this was designed and scripted for what it has been for them. What we see is a sort of tacit approval, and they set up a place called Tacit, which has DT and CIA in it, for T's acid, which nearly murdered me as a child, a battered child. There's a sort of tacit approval on the part of Puerto Ricans Edgar Martinez of the promotion of the people who murdered Roberto Clemente. There's a monolithic mania in the hogging of the Machiavellian NAACP, who promoted war games. When I turned to the rock industry about the problems of ecology in the 80s, they put out songs like Vroom and strutted around promoting their conspicuous consumption of automobiles, classic automobiles, and so forth. So we're not dealing with the 7 labors of Hercules. We're dealing with a new idea of Ouspensky's Superman, Nietzsche's Superman, of the master race, coming from Major League Baseball. Colin Kaepernick knelt just before the COVID operation. And they've been hiring attrition. If you say everybody matters, they say, what about this guy who we just paid to blow snot at you? And they have a toilet killer. They not only murdered my father, but I went into the bathroom and Clint Eastwood Boots came into the stall next to me and got out before I could see who it was. And when I pulled the toilet paper, there was feces on the toilet paper already. They've poisoned me in the mouth. They've tortured me. And they've claimed it is only you who are answerable. I have always had some differences of opinion about the so-called menace to society of the so-called axis of evil. They're always saying that Russia and Iran and North Korea are people who are Hitlerian, and it's sort of a generic idea of threat to U.S. sovereignty. But there are customs and borders for a reason. When Kim's sister says, "Shut your mouth" to South Korea, I cannot fail to hear the love in what she has for them and what she has said. Because what they are struggling to communicate is a failure to understand on our part. That's all. That's where my difference of opinion comes from. I believe that there was a certain amount of diplomatic progress in a strange way, in the way that Trump and Kim exchanged insults and then became friends. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think we are sufficiently different that we need to keep our distance from one another. But that's what customs and borders are for. But I don't think we should deny that we have failed to understand. The people of Afghanistan, the young men, the ones who we promote as demons, who are oppressing women, are struggling for lives. They care about their women children just like anybody else. Our failure to understand is driving some of this stuff. Now, you're not allowed to listen to anything like that. Police won't allow themselves to hear my point of view. A gym teacher once saw a kid conspicuously named Ewart, East West Art. His name was Fulham. He was black and he worked for the Pittsburgh Steelers part time. He, he came out of the dressing room, saw us chatting, and said, "Hey, Ewart, how come you're hanging out with that queer Carreri?" Now, UW dialectical Martinez might not say bad things about UW administration who hold as Trump, the injection needle of any milquetoast who sheds um, aspersions on the gay community. But they have a fail safe. I'm not gay, so it's okay. What are you doing with that queer Carreri? Is okay from the black man. Now, what we see in this, of course, is the Machiavellian nature of the NAACP. They're playing to win. They want vroom rights. I knew a woman who was elderly and interpreted for the deaf who came into the class that Dr. Proctor had all of the students sign a guarantee against not taking offense. And she was so offended by his sexualizing of things, by his trophy conquest ideas, his leering, that she demanded to be reassigned to other classes and not have to interpret for him. But when you look at the administration's refusal to address the preening and the gargoyles and the Rambo intelligence crowd kicking the notebooks of the poet and then calling themselves supermen and celebrities, you realize that there's a dialectic, a hidden dialectic. I don't particularly care for obsession, focus on dialectics, but there is one of who is really humiliated. In Casablanca, Humphrey Bogart has some very strange words to Ingrid Bergman, who came from Nazi Germany's cinema. He says, "For your sake, I let her pretend," to the leader of the underground, who's using a double cross, by the way, and who himself is suspected of fascism. "I let them pretend" was the idea that was rooted in Adolf Hitler's and the Axis revenge attack, which is now ongoing and virtually declared. Let them pretend comes from Borges, an Argentinian labyrinthian writer, who would, when there was a rival to the power Basso, actually give him everything he wanted to the point where allowing him to sleep with the Basso's wife and then announce himself the Basso, only to get a last laugh when the real boss had put a bullet in his head. They allowed JFK to pretend. That's what we're dealing with. The mechanics took his wife. Charles Bronson had a namesake present in Dealey Plaza. Just as they used Roberto Clemente's name to impinge on me with a betrayal from a woman who was targeting an implanted neuroplasm. This, they told me, was because of my heritage as my birthright, my claim to birthright was Hiroshima, they claimed. And so my birthright was canceled in favor of King Edward's idea that we have been allowed, because they're friends, to pretend that we had legitimacy. Now, how did it come about that they put me up to an ultimatum of death before dishonor for the gay community? If you look at bands like this, they're a Venus flytrap operation that drives people into rebellion and then ensnares them in the requirement for special services to the Nutter Coalition. And that is the specialty of Seattle, Washington, and the sad affair. If you look at this book, it's called This Peace. It's a very short book by Thomas Mann. I don't mean to demonize England back, but it says, we were pawns in a shameless game, driven wantonly to and fro between hope and despair. We were not politicians enough to see through it. Despite all that had gone before, we could not credit the prospect of such heaped up knavery and maneuvering. Our simplicity was culpable. What else could it be but hypocrisy to behave as one believed all those pullings about our brothers in the Sudetenland, when everybody knew it was not a question of the brothers, but of the Skoda Works, Czech industry, Romanian oil, and Hungarian grain? It was never a question of the resistance to climate change. It was about vroom, vroom. And the proof of it is in who was behind the operations of sibling rejection. But you find in this book a whole chapter on the friends of Tony Levin, who sent in the little Dolly Parton named Rosa to consummate his claim to vroom bragging rights. What we have in this idea is the traditional parochial idea of overcoming lust to give yourself empowerment. Well, why don't you just teach that instead of building a Venus flytrap? If you don't think this was cunning and intentional, take a look at Ian Watmaker, whose name is in the Texas school book, and whose father was an Attica State Prison writer who was a partner of Peter Gabriel when they tortured me. He asked me as a very little boy, what would you do if you knew the world was going to end right now? And he implied they were hypnotists, that you would run amok. What you do instead of that is you teach longevity and show in schools that people have hope. Instead, they come in with a laugh and a pun. You've all day. You have all day and gunned down our children. After controversy about betrothal, everyone holds their peace and accepts that two people have fallen in love. Instead, they're robbing our museums. John Schulman rubbed our faces in the idea that mayors behaved sometimes with great care during times of plague. That's what he was busy writing about while they justified their operation in the AIDS attack. There's things that show that there's these four women, Jacqueline Kennedy, Susan Sontag, Angela Davis, and Alice Kaplan, are four women that need to be investigated. But failure to understand works both ways. We have a very serious problem when it comes to failure to understand. The Proctors, who I largely admire when it comes to scholarship, but when it comes to psychology, I don't admire at all, had a man named Nate who used to knock out whites, and other whites would cheer. And you can't see in this Machiavellianism an indication of a desire by the Machiavellian whites to make blacks Machiavellian like themselves and include them in a super race. To whom I mean, they've already gotten the gays on their side with Vroom. There's nothing you can say to UW Dialectical when it comes to the gay community. They are a lost cause. And they come along and kick off our grannies and say it's building momentum. For who? For what? If you look at, for the Crow-Cagrigosta Chronic, for Yoko Ono is who? If you look at the whole thing, what comes from Yoko Ono's holding company, Yoko Ono not only targeted me and viciously tortured me and sent around Major League Rambo gargoyles to kick the notebooks of the poet Jinx, but she was well, I mean, obsessed with cruelty. She's one of these toilet killers mysteries, and so we need to speak up to administration. Why would Gallaudet stand there while Major League Baseball purposefully inflicted a humiliation on a deaf person? It's not like they're courageous when it comes. They have super strength. They can brutalize me. They've proven that. But they're chickenly and womanly. Louis Lapham can't evade responsibility for his role in this. They have a referendum of Assad's. This, they're chickenly and womanly about it, and they stand tall in domestic terror.